Einen wunderschönen guten Tag, meine Lieben, beim Gesundheitswort. Wir werden jetzt hier reagieren auf ein Video, was wohl ein unglaublich krasser Gamechanger sein soll. Ist gerade ganz frisch rausgekommen bei einem der krass wachsendsten Kanäle überhaupt im Gesundheitssektor Bodybuilding in Amerika. Ja, es war wie so ein Disclaimer am Anfang, angeblich irgendwie 30% mehr Lebensspanne oder so. Mal schauen, was da wirklich jetzt dran ist. Let's go.
Good morning, friends. Today, I will tell you about the biggest longevity hack known to man. And you've never heard of it before, most likely. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video for the sake of the algorithm. Before we get
Ja, ich gebe euch ja auch immer so eine krassen Sachen hier, ne? Ja, solche Sachen seht ihr hier bei mir in Deutschland auch als erstes, weil ich das ja auch zum Beispiel jetzt hier zeige. Also, du kannst ja sicher auch rüber abonnieren, ganz klar, nicht vergessen, mein Lieben.
started, for those of you that are not so familiar with the literature on longevity, most of the interventions seem to affect our nutrient sensing pathways in the body. You see, we have nutrient sensing pathways like AMP kinase and mTOR that when we have low nutritional status, and it shifts our body's gene transcription when that happens towards a repair process instead of a growth process or a reproductive process, for example. The second element that I'd like you to be aware of is that these
Also redet jetzt über so gewisse Wege halt, ja, dass man in einem gewissen Reparaturmodus ist, anstatt so halt prinzipiell nur aufbauen, das soll halt brutal irgendwie mit der Langlebigkeit einhergehen. Ist euch Langlebigkeit brutal auch wichtig? Gebt einen Daumen hoch, schreibt mir vielleicht einfach mal dazu einen Kommentar, was eure Ansicht dazu ist. Ja, interessenshalber und so weiter, dass ich da Bescheid weiß, dass ihr nicht nur Muskelwachstum sehen wollt und so.
interventions extend life to a lesser degree as the animal gets larger. So for example, the smallest species will have incredible life extension, whereas rodents may have over 30% life extension. Dogs may have over 10% or around 10%. There's actually a study using rapamycin on dogs, by the way. Whereas in humans, these interventions might only extend life by a few years. I want you to keep that in mind while you hear about the intervention that I'll be discussing in this video, which extends life far more than caloric restriction would likely do in humans. And also, before we get started with the subject today, I'd like to point out
Viel krasser als Kalorienrestriktion noch. Wow, Mensch, Leute, da müsst ihr euch ja vielleicht gar nicht so quälen, oder? Wow.
to you that I've never heard of anyone in the longevity community mention what I'm about to talk to you about today. I came across this literature by accident, having long had suspicions that this may be true. But now I think we have a lot of evidence to think it is true. Let's get started. So many of you may have heard of testosterone replacement therapy being life extending or healthy or better for longevity.
Redet jetzt über Testosteronersatztherapie, dass das halt ab einem gewissen Alter auch die Langlebigkeit erhöhen kann, wenn beim Mann die Hormone einfach durchs Altern kaputt gehen. So, das da sagt er so, das hat man gehört. Weiter?
Longevity or anti-aging, and these concepts are really not true at all. But the reason why people have this thought process, and by the way, if you'd like to know if TRT
Er sagt ja so, das stimmt gar nicht. Oha, was ist da los?
is healthy, I have a video on the subject that is very comprehensive. But the reason many people think that TRT may be healthy is because they notice that studies show that men with lower testosterone levels sometimes have ill health. And then they make the assumption that increasing the testosterone level in those men with drugs may improve their health. That assumption turns out not to be true, except in the case of metabolic conditions. You see, having higher testosterone levels causes lipolysis of fat and therefore may improve insulin sensitivity and so on. But other than that, it's not supposed to be considered health. Instead,
Okay, also ihr sagt, das an sich ist jetzt nicht messbar irgendwie krasser oder so, von der Langlebigkeit her, aber gewisse Nebeneffekte, die auftreten, wie zum Beispiel, dass dadurch die Lipolyse, also die Fettverbrennung angeregt wird, das hat dann wieder durch den optimierten Körperfettanteil wieder doch gesundheitliche Effekte, sehr spannend auf jeden Fall, weil ich auch schon so viele Videos gemacht habe, wie man mit gewissen naturalen Supplements den Testosteronspiegel optimieren kann und dadurch natürlich den Körperfettanteil reduzieren kann, meine Lieben.
low testosterone levels are a proxy of ill health. So if a man has dysfunctional health, for example, say you had very high inflammation levels, your testosterone level and your luteinizing hormone will decrease. So in a study, you may find a person has lower testosterone and assume that is the cause of the ill health, whereas it may be an effect of the ill health.
Leute, ich sage euch ganz ehrlich, ich muss schon wieder immer zu lachen. Ne? Ich habe gerade schon wieder einen TikTok gemacht, ne? Was gerade abnormal viral geht. Gell? Ich schiebe so gerade 1000 Views alle paar Minuten. Ich bin gerade schon wieder, kennt ihr das? Die YouTuber die kennen das. Wenn du mal ein Video gemacht hast, was so, sag ich mal, so 10, 20, 30k Aufrufe gemacht hat in kürzester Zeit, ne? Du bist in einem ganz komischen Gefühl drin, ja. Das kann ich auch mit gar keinem Supplement der Welt vergleichen. Also das ist so ganz, ich weiß nicht, unvergleichbar, ne? Unvergleichbar. Das wundert euch nicht, wenn ich die ganze Zeit am Rumdrehen bin, ja, am Durchdrehen.
A common factor, a cause, causing both the testosterone to be low and the person to have ill health. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion about the healthiness of TRT comes from. Instead, as many of you know, testosterone predisposes men to kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, and various other diseases. And generally, women live longer than men. I've long thought that women live longer than men because they have either lower testosterone levels or a combination of that and them having higher estrogen levels. And in fact, I think having the higher estrogen levels before menopause particularly protects them until they reach menopause. After women reach menopause, they become more vulnerable to several diseases.
Sagt er so, ja, Frauen haben ja geringere Testosteronspiegel im Allgemeinen, leben aber viel länger. Das passt dann schon mal nicht. Und Frauen hätten wohl auch größere Vorteile für Langlebigkeit wegen irgendwie besseren auch Östrogenspiegeln. Ich muss persönlich dazu jetzt sagen, ich habe gehört, dass es auf der einen Seite eine Östrogen-Vorstufe gibt und dann 2 Endstufen. Und die eine Endstufe ist sehr gesundheitsförderlich und die andere ist gesundheitsschädlich. Ich meine, Östron oder so ist die Vorstufe und Östradiol und Östro... bla bla bla. Es gibt nur eine Form, die ist irgendwie so hardcore krebserregend, die andere ist vor Krebs schützend. Und welche der Körper davon produziert, habe ich mal gehört bei diesem Video von Dr. Group, hatte ich auch schon mal ein Studienvideo zu gemacht, ja. Da ging es doch irgendwie um Gynäkomastie, weil Gynäkomastie auch ab einem gewissen Level auch gewissermaßen Brustkrebswachstum, auch, oder es ist ja irgendwo, ab einem gewissen Level ist das Brustkrebs wohl, ne? So dass daraus halt hervorgeht, dass Jod halt dafür zuständig ist, welches der Östrogene, das Krebserregende oder nicht, produziert wird. Deswegen nehme ich ja auch so abnormal für Jod, wie die Leute das auch bei mir in den guten Instagram-Fragerunden schon ein paar Mal beantwortet gekriegt haben.
But they still live longer than we do. To understand the incredibly powerful effect of inhibiting testosterone signaling in humans, we have to study eunuchs. And before that, I want to talk to you a little bit about what eunuchs are. The earliest evidence of eunuchs comes from a temple in Göbekli Tepe. This temple is dated to around 11,000 years before present. That's
Digga, was bringt der jetzt in Göbekli Tepe? Das ist doch so Präastronautik und Anunnaki und so. Das ist doch so ein Hardcore-Studienkanal. Und jetzt bringt er sowas hier ein? Das habe ich ja noch nie gehört bei denen mal auf dem Kanal. Was ist denn hier los?
From 9000 BC. Around that temple, there's a statue of a penis, of a phallus, without testicles. And this is thought to be an indicator that at that time, there may have been a religious practice of castration, removing the testicles by themselves. By 7000...
Hey, jetzt sagt er so, Kastration wäre, als ob das jetzt so geil wäre oder so geschichtlich. Bro, was kommt denn jetzt? Okay, hä?
500 BC, it appears that castration had become a religious practice for sure, done in devotion to the goddess Sibyl in the Neolithic Asia Minor. In later Roman times, the same goddess Sibyl became known as Magna Mater. For those of you that don't know, the Romans, when they would conquer a people, would adopt their gods and bring them into Rome.
Was ist das für ein verstörendes Video hier? Leute, ja, was ist denn hier los? Was ist da, hä? Weil, seht ihr das gerade auch irgendwie ein bisschen crazy? Gebt mal euer Feedback rein.
It was sort of a way of controlling the people, but they were also pagans, and they like sort of worshipped the other gods as well. Anyway, Sibyl, now known as Magna Mater, had a cult called the Galli, and the Galli practiced sacrificial castration for her on a day that was known as the Day of Blood. As such, castration is thought to have begun as a religious practice, and it continued being a religious practice into the 20th century. Some historians, in fact, believe that the Jews originally borrowed their practice of circumcision from the ancient Egyptians, who practiced circumcision as a kind of smaller castration to themselves in devotion to their gods. Indeed, one of the best kept secrets of the early Christians was that they were very fond of castration and practiced it themselves. In fact, if you look at the book of Matthew, I'll quote you a paragraph here. Jesus says in the book of Matthew 19:12, "Not everyone can accept this word."
Das Buch von Matthew, ist das Buch von Matthäus oder wie? Also, keine Ahnung, kommt das in der Bibel vor? Weiß nicht. Auf jeden Fall, Bro, es ist sehr, sehr wild. Also jetzt sagt er so, die Christen und so, die Juden und Dicker, was ist denn das jetzt alles? Dicker. Hä?
But only
Ob das so, sie sich so selber so kastriert haben alle.
those to whom it has been given. For some are eunuchs because they were born that way. Others were made that way by men. And others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. There be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. Now you may take that as a metaphorical passage, but it was not regarded so by early Christians. Going back in fact to just after the death of Jesus, let's look at how circumcision changed within the early Christian society. After Jesus' execution, Peter, James, and John all admonished the man who was formerly known as Saul but became Paul for preaching to the Gentiles that circumcision of the flesh was not necessary and that circumcision of the heart was all that Jesus called for. From primary sources, it's very evident that among early Christians there was major disagreement on this subject. In particular, those that knew Jesus during his lifetime and still lived in Jerusalem mostly supported that the early Christians should follow the Jewish practices, including eating kosher food and circumcising themselves and so on. Whereas those who never met Jesus, like Saul, later known as Paul, preached to Gentiles that they didn't need to follow all of the Jewish practices, which is probably one reason Christianity was able to spread so quickly in the Roman Empire. In the end, the first Pope, Simon Peter, condemned circumcision, setting the tone for the tradition among Catholics. This was very convenient for the early
Digga, will er jetzt mit der Geschichte darauf hinaus, dass es jetzt so wie so normal ist, sich die Hoden abzuschneiden oder was? Ist das jetzt das, worauf der jetzt hinaus will, oder wie?
Christians, because the Roman Empire also condemned circumcision. It condemned circumcision equally to castration. The Emperor Hadrian viewed circumcision as a kind of castration and punished it equally. Nonetheless, castration was practiced among early Christians trying to...
Digga, der ist wie Mo Plates Modetzer und Coach Greg Doucette. Der Typ, der wird doch jetzt bald in den nächsten 2-3 Monaten 1 Million Abonnenten knacken mit seinen Studienvideos und jetzt macht er hier so ein Video. Was ist denn das jetzt, Alter? Was denn das? Was macht er hier für ein Video heute?
Follow the word of God, including Origines. But there were also sects that did it. So for example, between the 11th and 14th century in southern France, the Catholic sect practiced ritual castration, and this was continued into the late 20th century by a Russian Christian sect called the Skoptsi, who we'll be talking about a little bit in this video. Despite this religious aspect of castration, castration also began to be used as a punishment. So for example, by Roman times, Rome would castrate some of their defeated enemies. And as recently as 1896, during the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, at the Battle of Adua, allegedly 7,000 Italians were castrated when they were defeated by the Ethiopians. In fact, it was done even more recently than that during the Chechen Wars in the 1990s. Historically, people distinguish between what are called natural eunuchs and eunuchs that were made that way. Natural eunuchs developed due to genetic conditions like Klinefelter syndrome or 5-alpha reductase deficiencies. Natural eunuchs were treated differentially across time. In some societies and time periods, they were killed immediately at birth, whereas, for example, in the Byzantine Empire, they were revered. In antiquity, 3 kinds of eunuchs were recognized: the castrati, the spadons, and the thlibate. It's very difficult to pronounce the last one. The last one is when somebody has their testicles bruised or damaged but not cut off, whereas the spadons have their testicles removed but not their penises, and castrati have both the penis and testicles removed. A second way...
Was? Was sagt der? Die haben nicht nur die Eier abgeschnitten, die haben den Penis auch noch abgeschnitten zur Kastration. Was, Digga, was ist denn das für ein Video? Worauf will denn der hinaus? Wieso sagt der am Anfang, man soll das krasseste Video, um älter zu werden? Sagt er so 30% länger leben? Digga, was ist denn das jetzt, Mann?
In which eunuchs were distinguished was according to when they were made eunuchs. So those that were made eunuchs before they entered puberty, for example in ancient China, were considered pure from birth, whereas those that were castrated in adulthood were considered pure of body. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the castrati, the most extreme form of eunuchs, because they have the most extreme biological effects. But by the way, the term castrati, you may be thinking of singers when you hear that, because there was also, in the 16th century, an Italian practice began of making young boys who had good singing voices into eunuchs to maintain their singing voices. These people were called castrati, which is where the term comes from. But I'm using it to refer to people who had their balls and penises removed, and usually before puberty. So we can see the most extreme effects of not going through reproductive puberty fully and having lower testosterone levels in adulthood. We will use examples, most importantly from the Korean court, but also from the Ottoman court, from the Chinese court, where, by the way, the test...
Jetzt sagt er so, ja, die haben den, als die Sänger waren, die Penis und die Hoden abgeschnitten, damit die sich nicht richtig in der Pubertät entwickeln, keinen Stimmbruch kriegen. Also wirklich, was hat denn das jetzt mit Langlebigkeit zu tun? Hä?
Testicles of eunuchs were kept in alcohol in boxes, either by the guy who cut them or by themselves. This is actually true. And we'll also take examples from the Skoptsi, the Russian Christian sect that extended into the 20th century. So what are the medical consequences of castration? Before I mention that, we should observe something. Castration is probably the first experiment ever done in endocrinology by humans. Aristotle himself wrote about castration. He wrote about castration of a bird, and he noted that their testicles were inside their bodies. They learned how to castrate birds. And he also wrote about castration of stags. He noticed in both that secondary sexual characteristics didn't develop fully, but he also noted, and maybe he was the first person to note, that castrated animals grew exceptionally large. In particular, they were taller and had longer limbs than uncastrated animals. Now let's...
Und jetzt sagt er, die haben also mit Tieren da ganz viel rumexperimentiert, Vögel sogar die Eier aus dem Körper raus und so, weil die wohl im Körper drin sind und keinen Hodensack außen haben. Und die haben dann angeblich wohl viel größeren Körper entwickelt dadurch. Was ist denn das hier?
List the major 6 medical consequences of castration other than longevity. The first is that castrated men had enlarged pituitaries, which makes sense because their pituitary is what produces luteinizing hormone to govern the amount of testosterone. They're producing luteinizing hormone, but their testicles are not feeling it. They're not getting the negative feedback indicator back to the pituitary. So over time, their pituitary may think it needs to grow to produce more luteinizing hormone. The size of the pituitary seems to be determined by when the castrated people got castrated, such that those that get castrated at 11 years old, for example, have the largest pituitaries as compared to people that are older. Second, eunuchs had disappearing prostates. They either had prepubescent prostates, which are very small, or they had prostates that were totally impalpable to the touch. This makes sense because people who have certain mutations in the androgen receptor, as well as people who have 5-alpha reductase insufficiency, are known to have prostates that don't grow past prepubescent size.
Als ob das jetzt Leute gibt, die nachher sagen so, ja, Digga, voll geil, Alter, 30%, jetzt hätte ich mich auch mal selber verstümmeln, Alter. Ey, ist das überhaupt egal? Darf man sich beim Arzt die Hoden selber abschneiden lassen? Oder darf... Was ist das für eine Frage? Ich weiß nicht, ich finde das irgendwie... Sogar wenn das jetzt krass ist, Digga, wer will das, Mann?
And since the 19th century, it's been known that castration reverses the growth of the prostate later in life as well. Third, eunuchs developed gynecomastia. Travelers noted that Ottoman eunuchs had large pendulous breasts. And if you look at the pictures of Chinese eunuchs, you'll notice that they have gynecomastia as well. In hypogonadal men...
Digga, was jetzt sagt er so, Digga, jetzt sogar Tits gekriegt, okay? Tits. Die haben sogar Tits gekriegt.
The aromatization of even adrenal androgens can be enough to cause gynecomastia. Fourth, they had osteoporosis. In fact, they developed even curvatures of the spine called kyphosis in later age. Interestingly, the extreme consequence of osteoporosis, kyphosis, was much less common among Ottoman eunuchs. Authors think it may be because of their relatively higher vitamin D levels because of where they lived, or because many of them came from African stock and they may have had higher bone densities originally before they got castrated. Fifth, eunuchs had unusually small larynxes and vocal cords, which caused them to have higher pitched voices and more flexible singing voices. And sixth, eunuchs were unusually tall, and this is because their estrogen peaked at a later date and they didn't have the epiphyseal fusion that, for example, women experience even earlier than men, and men experience when their maximal aromatization of testosterone happens. A recent analysis of the skeletal remains of eunuchs from the Ming Dynasty in China supports this conclusion as well. Now, why didn't I list the seventh effect there, matter-of-factly, their longevity? Well, there are some conflicting studies, and I believe I know the reason why most people don't know that castration extends life. I believe this was due to a sampling error. Most of the academics reviewed specifically the castrati of Italy, because most of the academics were Western, I think. And the castrati of Italy are not representative of what castration by itself does to a person. The castrati indeed had women posing as men, they had men that were not castrated among them, and even the castrated males must have had unusual lives because they were singers. A similar problem happens if you try to use male to female transsexuals to study the effects of inhibiting testosterone.
Digga, wenn man mit so ein Content hier, ne, damit kriegt er 2, 3, 400.000 Aufrufe auf seine Videos, ja? Also ganz ehrlich, ich sollte echt mal meinen Content umstrukturieren, ja? Immer alles nur auf Benefits, Studien. Digga, so eine Videos muss ich machen, dann krieg ich die Aufrufe, ja? So eine Videos muss ich machen hier. Ja, die Leute wollen so ein, da darf kein Mehrwert drin sein. Nein, so eine richtig, wenn ein Mehrwert drin ist, direkt nur noch 1/10 der Aufrufe. So nicht, okay? Leute, ich verstehe euch, ne, ich hab die Videos zu viel Mehrwert gemacht. Jetzt nur noch sowas, okay? Dann mache ich, was ihr braucht von mir.
Long-term on longevity, because male to female transsexuals have unusual lives and are not really representative of the standard population of men being castrated. Now, let me finally introduce to you the incredible effects of castration on longevity that go beyond anything that we could expect from rapamycin, metformin, caloric restriction, and so on. Now, by the way, animal studies are difficult to use here as well, so it's particularly rodent studies, because in rodents, males don't live much shorter than females. Instead, let's look at a study on rhesus monkeys. So, rhesus monkeys develop osteoporosis, thinner skulls, and exceptional long life when they're castrated before puberty. The most detailed and reliable account of the lifespans of eunuchs comes from the Korean kingdom, and the reason why is because in Korea, eunuchs used to adopt other eunuchs to maintain their lineage. And thus there were family trees of eunuchs that record carefully their age of birth and age of death. The Yangse Bo is the genealogical record of Korean eunuchs that we'll be discussing here. It was written in 1805 and covered 81 eunuchs. At the time, the average lifespan in Korea was only 51 to 56 years old, whereas royalty lived even younger, with their average lifespan being 45 years old. This is important to distinguish in case some of you think that the eunuchs were living a softer or easier life in the palace. They usually lived outside the palace and worked in the palace, but the people who lived in the palace died even younger than the people who worked outside the palace. Now, you guys know I wouldn't be so excited about a video unless there was a major impact, and I wouldn't say it's much more major than rapamycin and metformin unless it was. So what do you think the average age was of Korean eunuchs? You should pause and think for a second. What do you really think it was? Because the average age is 51 to 56, and the royals are living 45 years old. Do you think the eunuchs lived to an average of 60 years old, for example? Or 65? The average lifespan of Korean eunuchs was actually 70 years old, even then. That is 14 to 19 years older than the average age at the time, which was 51 to 56.
Okay, also die sind dann 14 bis 19 Jahre älter geworden. Das ist schon ganz schön viel. Also, na gut, da kann ich natürlich schön den Titel reinschreiben. Penis und Hoden abschneiden, so PH genau, für 30% mehr Lebenserwartung. Das kann ich dann schön reinschreiben. Super.
That is almost 40% more life from castration. In humans, you wouldn't find that in dogs. Moreover, among the 81 eunuchs chronicled in this study, 3 were centenarians. That is over 100 times higher rate of incidence of centenarians than in modern society. As you guys can see, I'm a little bit passionate about this because it's been a long time that I've been feeling that high testosterone levels are one of the causal factors for human aging, and it's been pretty hard to show people or convince people of it. Finally, now we have evidence that really confirms my thoughts. So what could explain this longevity effect? Well, most of you already know how high testosterone levels harm our health in terms of our brain health, our cardiovascular health, our kidney health. If you don't, check out my video on TRT. However, the exceptional long life among castrated men may go beyond this simple hormonal effect, beyond just reducing testosterone or increasing the estrogen to androgen ratio. So what could explain this huge effect on longevity beyond the direct endocrinological effects? Well, there's a theory of aging called the disposable soma theory, which essentially posits that resources are competitively allocated between somatic repair and reproduction, and that when they're allocated toward reproduction, they're done so at the expense of somatic repair. Essentially, according to this theory, we age because of an evolutionary trade-off between, on the one hand, growth and reproduction, and on the other hand, DNA repair maintenance, such that when we choose this hand, our DNA gets damaged over time and we age. This is the theory on which David Sinclair built his information theory of aging, adding in some inspiration from Claude Shannon. As a side note, while we're talking about Shannon, I should mention that Claude Shannon is a fascinating person, the founder of information theory, and there's a wonderful book that's about business, that's also about Claude Shannon, that I highly recommend, called Fortune's Formula by Poundstone. Fortune's Formula is a very enjoyable book that describes how Claude Shannon got interested in investing later in life, studied the subject, and then became an expert investor after spending his whole life as a scientist. Anyway, it's a really good book. Check it out if you like reading. I hope that this video was as valuable and interesting for you as it was for me. This is the first time anyone has on video talked about.
Gut, also wir wissen jetzt so weit über 30% als Mensch, ja, das war ja wirklich Menschenstudie, länger leben durch Kastration, ja. Leute, das war doch ein sehr polarisierendes Video, oder? Wenn ihr mehr solche polarisierenden Sachen haben wollt, dann lasst es mich auf Instagram DMs wissen und schlagt mir auch gerne Videothemen vor, wo ihr darauf reagiert haben wollt. Ja, wir sehen uns im nächsten Video. Ich wünsche euch noch einen wunderschönen Tag. Ciao.